Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andres Gomez, and I am the CHCI Altria Public Policy Fellow. I was raised by a single mother in Los Angeles, a Salvadoran immigrant. Really taught me the importance of saving and investing, which is why I'm delighted to be with you today for this breakout session entitled Fintech and the Future of Financial Inclusion. First, on behalf of CHCI, I would like to thank Rocket Mortgage, National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts, and MasterCard for their generous support of this session. In this session, we will look into how, despite major innovations in the financial services and digital banking in the past decade, American Latinos still face disproportionate access to wealth-building tools, with a third of Latino families remaining unbanked. We will hear from a panel of distinguished experts who are tackling this very issue. But before we jump into this discussion, we will hear from our sponsor speaker, remarks provided by Luis Corial, Staff Director at Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to be here today, and thanks to the CHCI for your invitation to speak here today. My name is Luis Correal, and I'm the Staff Director at the Office of Financial Education at the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We are a federal agency that protects consumers from discrimination, from deceptive, unfair, and abusive practices. We were created by Congress in 2010, and we opened our doors in 2011. Our mission is very important for all Americans, including Latinos. We also empower and educate consumers, and that's what I'm going to focus today. We conducted a financial well-being survey, which is a survey to measure the financial well-being of Americans, and we have been doing that for about 8 years. And it shows that Hispanics have lower financial well-being scores. It also shows that there's less Hispanics in the highest levels of financial well-being. And these levels is where there is financial security, where people are not worried about their finances, where people are not worried if they have an emergency. And then we see less Hispanics at the highest levels of financial well-being. However, the financial well-being survey does not tell us exactly why consumers responded the way they did, but various factors may play a role in these scores. It could be predatory lending and scams targeted at Latinos and other immigrants. It could also be lack of knowledge of the U.S. financial system. Also, systemic obstacles built into the U.S. financial system, disadvantaging Hispanics' generational wealth. And also limited English proficiency. There are about 26 million people in the United States who speak other language at home, and limited English proficiency can make it very difficult to conduct financial transactions, and they can make them more susceptible to scams and fraud. So we at the agency are looking at all these factors, but in order to help consumers empower them, we assess, identify, and distribute information in 8 languages, which are the top 8 languages per census numbers, including Spanish. And we focus on financial education that helps consumers spot risks, assert their rights, and know where to go for help when they need help. We also take consumers' complaints, and we do investigate them. We help consumers fix errors, solve problems, or the financial companies respond to them. And with that, I'd like to close. If you like more information, you can go to consumerfinance.gov. Thank you so much once again for your invitation, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Luis Corial. Now let's begin our conversation. To facilitate this panel, we are delighted to have Zach Guzman as our moderator for this session. Zach is an anchor and multimedia reporter, formerly with Yahoo Finance and CNBC. His stories and hosted series have been featured across multiple platforms, including Entrepreneur, NBC, MSNBC, Yahoo, MSN, and AOL. His reporting has been cited by the New York Post, People, ABC News, and Mashable. Please welcome our moderator, Zach Guzman.
Problems just because, they're difficult to solve, but sometimes even difficult to talk about in terms of why some of these problems exist. And just for my background, I'm half Mexican and half white. I've seen these issues firsthand in my own family. I've seen them, try to get solved over the last few years, but I'm excited to be here to serve as moderator on this panel with a very talented group of individuals who have been working in this space and seen these problems firsthand as well, and have, dedicated more time than I have, certainly, to kind of some of these issues as well. But I want to start just by introducing the panel to show you guys why I came down and why I was really excited to get to moderate this one specifically. And we can go down the line for quick intros here, starting with Mike, about what he's focused on in this space and what you've been up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So my name is Mike Fawaz. I'm with Rocket Mortgage. I've been with the company for 12 years. My parents are from the Middle East. I was born in Africa, in West Africa, Liberia. So when I'm asked, like, what's my nationality or what's my ethnicity, I have African American family, I have Middle Eastern family, and I have Hispanic family as well. So I'm all over the place, which is important to me to be here today, because for me, I feel like we deserve more when it comes to having the right to live the American dream and having the right to be able to acquire mortgages, financial tools, and things that would help us and our family and our kids excel. So I'm very passionate about this space, very, very passionate. I know Rocket Mortgage is also passionate about it, and that's why I'm here today.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Buenas tardes. Hope everyone's doing well. I am Jimmy Chow. I'm the Director of Community Relations at MasterCard. And what I do is I really focus on financial education for all communities. So I often partner up with a lot of different groups, and we go out to the community to provide this financial education because knowledge is power. I am very passionate about this because of my heritage. So I'm half Chinese and half Puerto Rican. Wepa! Where my Puerto right? I'm like, where my Puerto Ricans at? Way! We're always all over the place, and I love it. So that sort of really helped me with the work that I'm doing right now because, again, my parents are first generation, so I had to explain a lot of this stuff to my parents, as well as most of you. I see a lot of head shaking. So that's why I'm really passionate about this. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon. My name is John Jones. I work for NAREIT, the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts. NAREIT is the trade association for REITs and publicly held real estate companies. And I'm the senior vice president in their government relations shop, where I handle all advocacy in the House, Senate, and the Biden administration. In addition to that, I've published a number of articles on the intersection of real estate and technology. And prior to working in industry and real estate, I worked in government for 15 years. And in my last few years in government, I led an investigation of the Fintech industry and ways in which Congress could help what was then a growing industry in terms of what we could do for consumer protection. Thank the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute for putting this important panel together. Also thank the CFPB for supporting this work. I just want to take a couple seconds to say I don't know of any greater advocate for Black and brown entrepreneurs and consumers than CFPB Director Rohit Chopra. And with that, glad to be here and glad to be with this esteemed panel.
Nice to meet you all. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. My name is Laura Arce. You can call me Laura, that's okay. I'm Senior Vice President for Economic Initiatives at Unidos US. And I rejoined Unidos earlier this year to develop, launch, and lead a new initiative that we're working on focused on closing the homeownership gap for Latinos, which is a really important component of financial inclusion and generational wealth building. I've spent my entire career of over 20 years in Washington. I've worked in government on Capitol Hill for a regulator, the Federal Housing Finance Agency. other nonprofits besides Unidos US, and I've also been on the corporate side for Wells Fargo. And the thing that ties my career is I've always focused on consumer finance, particularly mortgage banking matters. It's something that, as a first-generation, Chicana from Oakland, California, I just saw very early on when I got particularly to college, just the differences in how different families handled finances and money in their experience. And it was something that just became a deep interest and passion of mine to help our community build generational wealth and really become financially independent as part of the financial mainstream. So I'm really excited to be on this panel today with all of you.
As a journalist too, I just got to say, your guys' data makes my job so much easier to cover a lot of these things because it's hard to find the time to dig into all the numbers. But we're basically going to split this panel up into a few different ways to dig into some of these issues. We can start with the problem and really identify it as kind of how different it is across racial lines and kind of some of those problems in fintech. Because fintech's a great solution if everyone gets to enjoy and all the things that it promises. But if really not everyone has the same access to it, then that actually makes the problem worse in some sense. So just starting with some of the data first, and Laura, you might know this a bit better, but just so everybody knows, when we look at being underbanked or unbanked, the numbers are pretty striking when you think about Hispanics in the US, and 2% is the number for white Americans, and it's closer to 6 times that for Hispanics. And when we think about being unbanked, you really don't have access to any of the strongest thing I think about being American is the banking system and the financial services that we offer as the world's strongest economy. And so I guess, we'll dig into some of the housing stuff, but just starting on the banking issues, and Jimmy, you might have more connection to this through your MasterCard years, but when you think about that number and how striking it is, how surprising is it, and what do you think is really, I guess, some of the bigger issues to dive into in that number specifically?
Me?
Yeah, if you want to start.
All right, sure. Start off. Well, thank you for that question. One of the things that we always do is just really sort of, whenever I talk about MasterCard, I always let people know that we are not a credit card company, right? So we are a technology company that supports the credit card. So the stuff that happens behind the scenes, that's the stuff that we do at MasterCard, okay? You get your credit cards from where? The bank, right? Exactly. So that's always sort of like the first thing I always tell people. On top of that, when your question is, why is the Latino community so underbanked? A couple of reasons pop in my head. First, it's a distrust, right, in the banking system, and a distrust in being able to trust your local bank. Also, there's financial deserts, so there may not be readily available banks in different areas. And then the other thing I was also thinking about, I was talking to some friends of mine, and also it could be a cultural thing, right? I have a good friend of mine, she's from Mexico, and she's like, well, her family was always just like, no deudas, right? Don't have any debts. So coming to America, where everything is with a credit card and things like that, that was a struggle for them. So really doing everything in cash was sort of like the way that they've sort of been used to. When they came over here, things are a little bit different. So part of what we do is just really educate people in terms of understanding that everyone can have some sort of electronic payment, whether you're documented or not. There are a lot of different products out there, prepaid cards, secure cards and things like that, that will sort of help educate people. And so, I think those are some of the barriers that a lot of people face. And, again, technology is a great equalizer, but there's also disadvantages with that as well. So at MasterCard, we try to sort of build a bridge around that, but sometimes it's a little challenging.
Yeah, I guess you mentioned trust, and the other one too, as far as reasons why we might see those numbers, from a few different surveys, is also just the minimum banking fees and requirements for a lot of those accounts as well. And John, you've spent a lot of time kind of in maybe some of the public policy side of some of these problems, and that is an issue where if there are those banking requirements and minimums, then you get into kind of just general income inequality and everything else. But is there something else specifically that you see as maybe some of those issues around maybe the underbanked numbers that we're talking about?
Sure. Right away, I would say, just to piggyback off what Jimmy said, a lot of it does come down to trust, and whether it's going to be trust of an employee or trust of an institution. If you don't have that sense of familiarity, well, then you're looking at it being a risk. And so why are you going to take that risk? I grew up in a city called Plainfield, New Jersey, and my father's African American, my mother's white, Jewish, and every weekend I would go to my grandparents' home who lived in the Farragut housing projects in Brooklyn, New York. While my mother's parents, he was a doctor, she was a nurse, they lived in a very nice penthouse in Staten Island. So going from the projects to the penthouse in one day, I got a pretty good understanding that these were all hardworking people, but there's a reason someone's in a penthouse and someone is living in the projects in a community where everyone looks like them. And I said that came down to opportunity and built-in mechanisms that were basically put in place to help certain groups of people. And I think what the focus has to be on is equalizing opportunity, but understanding the shortcomings that exist, especially policy-wise. When we look at not just the unbanked, we also get into what happens in terms of loans and lending and small business lending. And I think in terms of policy, the way in which we can really deal with some of these issues so that we have more trust is, number one, being cognizant and aware of the fact that algorithmic bias exists. And just as people can have biases, so can machines. And when you're talking about machine lending to a degree, that's going to have a spillover effect. Number two, it's really important that companies consider, at a minimum, the benefits of third-party audits to ensure that your lending practices are actually fair and truly colorblind. And number three, when you talk about dealing with institutions and dealing with companies, it's important that senior leadership also reflect the racial makeup of your consumer base or America in general. And I think all of those issues come down to trust. And unless you have some attention to these issues, it's really going to be very difficult to deal with the issue of trust, whether it's in lending or dealing with small business lending or actually dealing with the unbanked.
We'll probably get into lending on mortgages
Can
as well.
I add to that, though?
Yeah.
Because I love the fact that you brought up the racial makeup of the consumer base. I also think it's important to figure out the racial makeup of the team members base at those institutions. Because our people, and I'll speak for myself, my mother, she's from Lebanon, and it took me like a year to convince her to open a bank account because that's not things that we're used to, right? But then when I took her to the bank and then the teller at the bank spoke Arabic, that created that trust. So it is on us these financial institutions, we need to be able to hire people within communities that speak the language, that are able to relate with the customers and be able to serve them too. I think that's a big deal.
I'd be remiss too to not mention that we're going to have a Q&A portion of all this too. So we'll ask some questions up here too, but at the end of it, we'll get into any questions that you all might have to provide as well. But John, I mean, you make the point. Yeah, for sure.
John, just thinking about how I framed the issue of sort of why folks are unbanked. I mean, most of you may be familiar with the FDIC does a survey every 2 years of how America banks. And the top two reasons across the board, not just Latinos, but all consumers don't bank. One is they don't have the minimum balance requirement to either open an account or to maintain the account without a fee, or the trust issue that we've been talking about. I think if you unpack a little more detail specific to Latinos, there are additional barriers, whether it be language access, whether it be the documentation requirements needed to open a bank, or the perceived documentation requirements needed to open a bank, or honestly how welcoming Latinos feel, whether it's in a bank branch or just with a bank, a company in general. When you start kind of shifting toward what the policy solutions are, I think it's important to then really understand, so who isn't banked and why is that? And I think there's the category of folks who have never been banked versus those who have been in the banking system and no longer are. So people who have never banked, some of them, education, awareness, better products from the industry will certainly help. But we also have to recognize there's a segment of the population, they want to be off the grid. And so I personally don't believe we'll ever get to 100% banked. So there is some of that. But a really important segment of the unbanked are those who previously have been banked and no longer are. by and large, those folks had a bad experience. Maybe they had a few overdrafts, their account got closed, they ended up owing money to the bank so they couldn't go back in. And I think both the industry together with the regulators need to come forward with some solutions about how can we bring people back into the system? Are there de minimis amounts that we can just forgive, the reporting on credit and others for those negative balances? Some of the screens that go into place, for folks, particularly if it's been a long time. Otherwise, there's going to be a segment of the population that once they're out, they're never going to get back in. But a really important component is back to this point of trust. Because even if you solve for those policy issues, if a consumer does not, if they've already been hurt once, it's going to be harder for them to believe what the bank is saying, even if they're saying, no, we want you back, and we're going to offer something that will bring you back. So trust is clearly a component that's really important.
I promised good data. She delivered on that. This is exactly what I was talking about there. But I mean, no, it's true. And, I think, what's tricky about a panel like this is when we're dealing with so many different kind of gradients of looking into Hispanic, we were talking about, immigrants and then first generation American, second generation American, and the culture behind some of this too. If you're coming from a place that's largely cash operating, and then you talk about the trust issue. And Mike, we were talking before in preparation for this panel kind of about how so many solutions have come around in solving a lot of those problems and the complexity of dealing with it or having to go to the bank. And Fintech specifically, when we talk about that and trust, what do we make of kind of, I guess, how some of that distrust carries over, not just in the banking system, but to Laura's point earlier around documentation and some of this stuff as well. I mean, if you also don't trust the technology, or how the technology should be used, or maybe there's an education element there because this whole system in the country not so great at explaining financial education in the first place. I mean, how do you look at maybe the problem and solution aspect of the technology itself?
Yeah, one word, education. Give you an example, at Rocket Mortgage, we partnered up with Fannie and Freddie, and we created a couple of programs that help folks obtain a mortgage without having to have a perfect score and 20% down. And not every single person has perfect credit. Not every single person has all that cash in the bank. And when we look at these programs, we brought to the entire community a program called Home Possible and another program called Borrower Smart. But when we look at the usage, the percentage is still very, very low. Because it goes back to education. It goes back to, are we educating our communities of what's available to them? Do they even know that these programs are available to them? I just spoke with a group of about 100 realtors, and they were asking me questions, especially in our communities. They're like, what do you have available? And when I went through the programs, they were very surprised. They're like, are you telling me that someone with a 620 FICO can put 3% down and don't have to do an FHA program where there's MI, nothing wrong with the program, but they can actually get a conventional mortgage? And when I explained that, they were very surprised. But my challenge to the group was, this program has been out there, and it's been out there for the last 6 months or a year. As a realtor, and are you taking the time to educate yourself on those programs? So when someone is knocking on your door and they're asking you they want to qualify for a mortgage, are you able to coach them, and are you able to get them to qualify for that mortgage? It goes both ways. And I think for us as mortgage professionals, as realtors, as professionals in this industry, if we truly believe that and we're passionate about serving our communities, it starts with us really understanding what's available and really understanding that there are opportunities. I'll give you guys an example. With Rocket Mortgage, we created a program called Credit Upgrade. We know that sometimes, especially for me, when I moved to this country, I didn't even know what a social security number was. I didn't know how to obtain credit. So my first round on trying to build credit, I didn't do a very good job with it. My credit score was really bad because I didn't know better. No one educated me. I moved here, I was a kid, went to school. I didn't have a family member here to tell me, hey, by the way, you got to pay on this time. You got to do this or that. But then I started learning. And then I started to understand that, hey, you got to maintain perfect payment history. You got to do this. You got to get a secured credit card. You got to do a lot of things to be able to accomplish this American dream. You need your credit. So what we did at Rocket Mortgage is we created a program called Credit Upgrade. And I'm on the wholesale side of Rocket. So what I do is I work directly with brokers across the country. So what we're offering, we're giving all of our brokers access to this program. which means that now our brokers can take this program and work with someone with a 550 credit score and educate them of how to get to a 620 and qualify free of charge. It's something that we can bring to our communities. And it's one of the things that I was very passionate about, because again, credit matters, but education. It's about how do we even know how it works? Are we educating our people? So please, I ask everyone, and I talk to professionals a lot, if you're in this industry and you truly passionately believe in our people, in our communities, you gotta educate them, you gotta do your research and learn about all these incredible things that are out there that can help our people.
I think it's a really good point, especially if we're talking about the problem and not even knowing some of the things that go into the problem.
You'll be
credit.
surprised.
Yeah, and Jimmy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that when we talk about, I guess, credit and the way that some people operate around that, or even if the community itself, again, I wasn't taught this in school necessarily. You don't learn that.
Right, and I wasn't taught that either. It's like one of these things where after you've made some mistakes in your financial life, that's when you start realizing, hey, I got to fix this, right? So education is the key, and I can't echo that even more because that's basically how people can sort of change their paradigm of where they are. That's what I do. So I go out to different community groups and we do provide this education. I do stuff from ages 5 through elementary school, high school, college, adults, seniors, even small business owners, just to talk to them about financial education. And we cover things very basic. Checking, savings account, how to save, right? The differences between different electronic payments, credit. And people were just like, well, how do I build my credit? I'm like, pay your bills on time, right? It seems very simple, but that's how you can do these things. And so I encourage everybody who comes to some of our workshops to spread that word, right? I always tell people, teach other people in your community, teach your friends, family members, right? Because that's how this will spread. Because I know my madrina, which is my godmother, she's on Facebook, right? So somebody had taught her how to use Facebook, and she's always like sending me tags and stuff like that. And I'm like, madrina, stop. But if she can learn how to use Facebook, I think she can learn how to use some of the technology that's available. And you're never too old to learn. So I think that's important. I think the education piece is critical.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point in terms of never too old to learn is important, especially, I guess, when we're talking about technology on top of it, and there have been a lot of lenders and other institutions that have entered the space, maybe that would have already invalidated anything that we would have all learned in high school since, things change so quickly. But I guess, when it comes to educating people on the new technology, it's still dealing with the old system when we talk about credit scores. So, that's one thing, and partially, in the crypto scene, that is one thing where it's like, okay, a whole new system where credit's not attached to it. Of course, that might change as we kind of develop and more institutions are built on top of all this. But Laura, I'd be curious to hear more about kind of maybe some of that credit piece of all this, specifically when it comes to the education element of credit. Why we think that we're so far behind when it comes to some of the differences across racial groups.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of pieces there. Certainly the education component. I think most of us in this room, particularly if we're immigrants or just first or second generation, we know folks in our family. I know my own story. I remember my grandfather. He didn't believe in credit. Credit was bad. He used to go downtown every month and pay his utility bill and water bill in cash, get a stamped receipt. He had a savings account, but the credit wasn't a thing. So it wasn't something that we learn. So I think education is really important. And, to your point, Mike, I think, it's all kind of incumbent on all of us. Heck, if we're in this room, high probability we went to college, we have a good job or we're about to get a good job. Like, we should be helping our community, whether that's our family, our neighbors, and others, and finding ways to plug into that. So the education piece is really important. There are a lot of resources out there, whether it's community-based organizations offering services. I know a lot of these companies have really great websites where they have tools and that you can kind of go on and learn. But on the flip side, I think, there's also responsibility on, the industry and kind of the regulatory framework. And so when you think I'm most familiar in the mortgage space, you think of kind of the old-fashioned, when you think of someone buying a house and in the 50s, what I imagine it was like, people talked about the 3 C's, right? It was credit, collateral, and character. And you would walk in, and it was definitely, if it was in the 50s, it was a man, and he was probably, married, and he had his job with his pension, and it was a very, it was probably a white neighborhood because the other neighborhoods were red line. So it was a very kind of box, in terms of how they were assessing credit risk and that person's willingness and ability to repay the loan. We're in a very different space today. Our country's so much more diverse. The type, not just people, but the types of jobs we have. We don't have that same where we worked in the same company for 30 years. People switch jobs. People have multiple jobs. People have gig economy. Their income may fluctuate. They're in not your traditional types of households. And so, but the system is not kept up with how do we assess credit risk? How do we measure someone's willingness and ability to repay? Because that's what it's all about. And I think there's a lot of catching up the industry needs to do that. Technology for sure can help us there, but I think there's some regulatory kind of foundational things that also need to change that will allow and incent the industry to make those changes. So I'm excited about a lot of the things that Rocket and others do to open that up, because I think they do need to push the envelope in those areas.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important too, just because homeownership is so huge, right? And I guess I see some young faces in the crowd here, and it's changed considerably, I think, when it comes to the idea of younger Americans even enjoying in the dream of homeownership. And John, I'd go back to something that you said earlier, because I live in Brooklyn, and you talk about kind of some of the different communities, and even ones that may not have looked so good decades ago. If you bought into those and you had stuck around long enough to see maybe some of the changes over time, you would have enjoyed in the economic upside of some of that stuff. But when we talk about the crowding out of even anyone owning anything in their communities and wanting to be a part of those communities to make them better, if you don't really own it, there's no real sense of ownership in those communities. And we talk so much about the importance of mortgages and owning a home. But specifically for, I guess, the younger crowd, it's just not really in reach as much anymore. And it's not the 1950s. What you're describing is so far detached from, not just the technology of today, but also just the realities of today too. So, how much does that maybe also add to the problem when you think about those farthest on the fringe of enjoying in the American dream?
Absolutely. In the community that I grew up in, one of the things that really sparked my interest in real estate is that where I lived, it seemed that the folks who owned the majority of the land, the real estate, and owned and operated the majority of the businesses were not from my community. I remember on Sunday, I'd always see the landlords come in and so forth, and I would say, wow, I think that's where the power is, I guess. So real estate was about ownership for me and empowerment. And when you mention technology, that's something we're really gonna have to talk about, where the technology is going, what's the future of this technology and how it really impacts certain communities. You could take policing, for example. What if you have the robotic cop, the non-human robot who's issuing parking tickets or speeding tickets? Well, ideally, if in a perfect world, that robot will focus on de-escalation, will not use aggressive language, will try to handle challenges peacefully. Well, at the same time, that robot, if it's going to be a product of the biases that the inputs are placed inside of it, well, then it may judge how someone is stressed. If they're speaking a different language, that may put them on notice. They may respond more aggressively, right? And that's something we're gonna have to really grapple with. What are we doing to be involved in the formation of this technology? What are we doing to actually build experts in our communities to really deal with the challenges of future of work and automation? And going back to your original point in terms of home ownership, it is way more challenging today than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, absolutely. The financial education is very, very important. The value of owning a home, that being taught early, the establishment of credit. But again, it goes back to trust as well. If you are obtaining a loan or seeking to get a loan, I think consumers also want to have insurance that they're not going to be discriminated against based on the zip code or neighborhood that they happen to live in, whether you're trying to get a loan for a home or if you're trying to get a loan for a business. That assurance that if you have a number of bankruptcies in your neighborhood, is that going to be held against you, even if you're the one who hasn't filed for bankruptcy? Well, what if you have a lot of arrest or police activity in your neighborhood? Is that something that reflects poorly on you? If you live in an over-policed community, you're going to have more police action or arrest in your particular neighborhood. And I think more safeguards and insurances in place that's not going to impact someone when they're trying to get a fair capital lending product. In terms of home ownership, one thing we also have to talk about, and this is, NAREIT represents a broad real estate portfolio, everything from single family homes all the way to data centers, warehouses, hotels, and so forth. The challenge we have today is that a lot of folks understandably want affordable housing, but even in cities, Republican and Democrat, folks don't want a lot of times new development. It's very difficult to get community city councils to sign off on affordable housing development in their community. And when that happens, it impacts Black and brown and low income communities the most. And so that's what we have to also look at too, this idea of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Unless we have more product, we won't have more availability. The crux of the issue, though, is what we talk about is inequity. How do we deal with these issues of inequity? Folks who don't, like myself, I did not have a trust fund to tap. I would have loved the trust fund to tap. I said to my dad, what are you doing? I should have had a trust fund.
Where's my trust fund?
Where's my trust fund, man? Right? And what are we doing to deal with that issue at the core? And something we have at NAREIT is the Dividends Through Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative. Yeah. And I highlight the word equity. Equity is ownership, equity is power, and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And it's not just making sure our companies and our firms have Black and brown faces on the website in the senior leadership position. It's about when we're doing conferences like this, right? Mm-hmm. Ensuring that we have Black and brown ownership for the companies that set up the stage, do the lighting, provide the food, provide the security, provide the catering. That's the real equity when you talk about the vendor and opportunities that come forth through events, through everyday activities. We're working now with our member office buildings and hotels to ensure that the companies that may have used for the subcontracting opportunities for the last 20 years, we have to shake that up. Right? Because at the end of the day, that does impact everyday opportunities for Black and brown residents.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's pretty powerful stuff too. When you just think about, there have been a lot of stories kind of focused on the not in my backyardism stuff as well, where policy and public statements by a lot of politicians might not match up with what you're seeing in those communities and the way that they're built and the way that some of these projects are pursued. And yeah, I mean, we've covered a lot. We're going to get into the Q&A portion of this in just a second, but I mean, we've covered a lot, and I would attest to that too. I also don't have a trust fund. I also had to deal with collections. Even when I was working, Yahoo Finance was owned by Verizon. I had somehow missed a bill. Verizon came after me. My stuff went to collections. It was never good. And that stuff dings your credit score, and then you're playing catch up for a long time. And it's just, obviously problematic. And I can't complain because it's not like I had a family or anything else to keep track of. It was just me being lazy.
I got credit upgrade for you.
Okay, there we go. Mike's going to connect with me after the panel. But no, I mean, before we get into the Q&A, Mike, I mean, we talked a lot about the technology aspects of all this too, and we've talked a lot about like some of the bigger problems. But when we hone into what individuals can do, I guess, in their lives or stewards of their community when they leave this panel, I mean, what are maybe some of the key, easier flexes, easier points you always make at these kind of conferences to really fix some of the problems in actions we can all take? Yeah,
so look, whatever world you're in, if you're like a real estate agent, if you're a mortgage professional, if you're just in finance through banking institutions, whatever it is, find out, learn more about what's available in those sections, sectors, whatever you want to call them. Find out what is available, learn about it, and go do it. And don't be afraid. I'll tell you, I moved to this country 23 years ago. And when I showed up to Michigan, somehow I picked Michigan, by the way, no Florida, no California, somehow Michigan, I looked outside out of the window from plane and I saw snow, and I've never seen snow in my life. And to sit here on stage today and to go, I mean, I do a lot of speaking and I represent Rocket, but to be able to do so is an honor. And I'm sure my family is proud. I'm hoping my family is proud, by the way. But don't be afraid. It doesn't matter where you come from. When I moved here, I did not speak a word of English. I remember when I first started at Rocket, my very first day on the phone, I was worried because the person I'm going to call to try to write a mortgage for them will hear my accent, and I thought they won't do a business with me. And it took me a long time to understand that it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to fall, but if you're passionate about something and if you're passionate about your background and your heritage and your community, go for it. And I spend personally a lot of time educating my family, people around me, my community. I give my time to help others because I don't want people to go through what I've been through. There's so much technology. I'll tell you, we work with brokers across the country, and we have technology that we built through Google where any mortgage professional can know about any guideline within 2 seconds. Like, you don't even have to make a phone call. You can see all the guidelines and you can determine if someone qualifies or not. And these are great, and we need to use them, and we need to use them for our communities. But again, it goes back to us. Are we willing to put in the time? Are we willing to put in the time to understand all the tools available to help our communities? There's so much out there, and there's so much you can do, and don't be afraid to do it. Don't be afraid to fall. It's a matter of time. I was just telling you earlier, I'm just some kid from Africa, and here I am today.
Yeah, that's, again, why I wanted to come to this panel, just because, these stories are really, I think, the ones that I think a lot of people can get out of it. And, just seeing some of the initiatives at other conferences where it is equality missions at some of the, less represented areas. As I said, crypto, and it was an empty room, basically. So there's effort there for them to put in, these are problems we need to address, and no one's in the room. So it's like, well, that looks good, but how are we going to solve these? And it does come down to kind of the effort you want to put in. Jimmy or anyone else, I don't know if you have anything to add on maybe the specific takeaways.
No, it's funny because every time I do a workshop, whenever I have adults in the workshop, like, I wish I would have learned this when I was younger, right? And I'm like, well, you still can, right? So it's all about really education. And like you said, don't be afraid. And what we try to do is, I know whenever I go to some of these events, we do it in English and in Spanish, because again, we want to build that trust within the community. And there's that key word that we talked about before. But that's one way we can do this. And we have a website with all handouts, videos, a learning platform, both in English and Spanish, that we direct people to, because again, everything that we have is for free. We want to sort of offer it to people. So that's basically what we do.
2 quick things, if I could add. Number one, education is key. I focus on the area within Fintech called PropTech, which is short for real estate technology. That's basically the digitization of the real estate sector. But I see there are a lot of students, a number of students in the room. I think it's important to look at whatever industry you're in and look at how technology is going to impact it over the next 5 years. For instance, the best lawyers are in the courtroom practicing, but you also have a number of lawyers looking at the issue of intellectual property and smart contracting and how that's going to be impacted by blockchain. Some of the best doctors are practicing medicine, while at the same time they're looking at how technology and robotics is going to change surgery in ways and diagnosing illnesses in ways we've never been before. Folks who are working in the insurance industry are looking at InsurTech and how that's going to impact their changing industry. And the second point is sometimes we have to call people out and have uncomfortable conversations. We have a lot of federal workers in the building. A lot of federal workers happen to be Black and brown who commit and contribute to their pension funds, right? Pension funds are the biggest institutional lenders in the world, probably put the money up for this building and the Marriott next door, which is great. How many of these federal pension funds are actually managed by Black or brown asset managers? These are the uncomfortable questions we have to ask people, because the institutional true equity, if it's not happening, it will never impact the true equity at the bottom of the ladder for folks who, again, aren't looking for giveaways, aren't looking for the equalization of outcomes. They want the equalization of opportunity.
Just the shot. That's all they want. And those are the numbers always, again, kind of speak for themselves. I covered cannabis for a while as well. And those are ones where maybe it's not the dollar impact when we're talking about the economy, but just the discrepancy in the numbers as far as arrests go and representation at the top. Even you look at the top 10 cannabis companies, it's one representation as far as black and brown leaders at those. And you think about the numbers as far as the arrests go, it doesn't add up. None of it adds up. We will open for Q&A though for people who want to. Oh yeah, by all means. I'm good looking at time cards, but yeah.
I know. We're not ignoring you with the time cards, but I did have 3 things people can kind of act on if there's an area of interest for you. So first, if those of you in the room who are students, who are younger, trying to figure out what you want to do and you're interested in delving into this, I suggest go into the STEM field, computer science, math, because fintech is technology first solving a financial problem. And so look at that industry, look at technology. The second thing I'll say for those of you, particularly I imagine a lot of folks are visiting from other communities, but if you're interested in helping your neighbors in your communities around banking issues, look up Cities for Financial Empowerment. There's a program they run called Bank On. And what they do is they have national standards that most of the big banks have and some non-banks have adopted in terms of responsible banking products. And many cities have Bank On coalitions where they're out there in communities helping to bank the unbanked in those markets. And so join the coalition. And if your community doesn't have one, reach out to them and see maybe you can start one in your community. And then my third tip for those of you who are maybe more kind of my generation, a little older, and sometimes you feel like, gosh, maybe I didn't start early enough for saving for my retirement and all of that. I will just say it's never too late to start. And the number one thing you can do is take care of your health. Because while you can't go back in time and put in money that you should have been putting in 10, 20 years ago, if you can extend your longevity, you have more time to accumulate assets. So take care of your health, and that will impact your financial well-being.
All good points, and I'm glad that we got those in there. I'm sorry I almost didn't get those in there, but I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. If there are any questions, you can step up to the mic and address them.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Chris Wilkie, CEO of SHIP. And so it's a very interesting conversation in the sense of we've talked a lot about the need for education, the lack of trust, et cetera, in the fintech industry overall from the community. Yet if you look at industry, the job growth, particularly on the technology side, is outpacing anything that we can keep up with. We know the Hispanic community is growing at the rate that it is and is likely a valid solution to those jobs. What I didn't hear a lot about today is if the community doesn't trust the fintech industry to begin with, fintech needs the community to fill the jobs. What is industry doing to change, and what are you seeing as best practices to attract that talent coming out of STEM? That's one of the biggest things I hear from our corporate partners is we're seen as financial industries and they don't realize we're tech. But if the community doesn't trust you to begin with, there's a little bit of an identity revamp that needs to happen, right? And so I'm curious what those best practices are that you're seeing that's working.
Okay, it's a great question. At MasterCard, what we're doing is really reaching out to communities. And we work with different organizations to provide that STEM learning and apprenticeship opportunities, internship opportunities at MasterCard, and from there, hopefully land a position at MasterCard. Because like you said, the community is growing, right? And we need to diversify our slate of employees. So how do you do that? Start from the beginning, right? Groom them, educate them so they can sort of be easily placed in different roles here at MasterCard. So and there's still a lot of stuff to be done.
Anybody else have anything else to add to that one? Or if not, we can go to other questions if they are up there. The mic's free, and also.
I'll add something very quickly. Number one, I think it's important, of course, to support the development and support academic programs like the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute does in terms of development and support for fellowships and internships. I'm a former fellow with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I would not be here today if it weren't for that fellowship. So that's very important, number one. Number two, it's also important for companies and firms to also utilize executive search firms. They're actually run by racial minorities. I think that's very, very important. It's very flattering sometimes when companies call me and ask for help regarding trying to fill a position. At the end of the conversation, I have to remind them that I'm not an executive search firm. You should hire one and let them know what you're actually targeting. It's going to cost more money than free, but it's actually something that we've actually seen with some success. Yes.
Well, first, thank you all for being here. Zach, you mentioned crypto at the beginning. I think that it's super essential if we talk about financial inclusion to talk about crypto, because it was born because of the decentralization and the distrust of people towards the financial system. And then also, John, I really appreciated that you said that equity is about power and ownership, right? Because you cannot have equity without financial empowerment or communities. But of course, that requires equity, right? And that requires education. Something that you all mentioned is financial education, democratizing financial education, to sort of create generational wealth, equity, power, all of that. But we know that education, it's not only the tool, it's not only how to use the tool, but rather is, the values that you have in this case, towards money, towards wealth, all of that, the frameworks, the intellectual, psychological, knowing the legal frameworks, and that you can, and then the tools that you can use to leverage that, and also the access, to the network to be able to create that wealth. So, in this case, I want to hear, now that we spoke so much about education, some concrete examples that your companies are working on to educate our communities. And if you could share with us any resources that we can take back to our communities to then create, this equity that we are talking about when it comes to financial inclusion.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. As I mentioned, I lead the wholesale side at Rocket, so I work with brokers across the entire country. And we talked about creating technology, because for us, we're not actually a mortgage company. It's funny, you brought it up earlier with some people talk like, hey, we're a tech company, we're not finance. We're actually a technology company. So we partnered with firms like Google, where we created, call it the Google for mortgages. And it's information at your fingertips. It's information that gives you certainty. So what we are doing for us, at least in my world, is we're educating our entire broker community, community by community, on the tools that we have available for them and the things that we have out there, so they can in return take it and help their communities. So again, it's just, I don't think you can solve this overnight, but you got to continue just going through communities, working with partners in these communities. So at least for it's very easy because I have partners everywhere. So we have the reach. And this is just some of the things that we're doing. We have many more other things that we're going to be rolling out in the next 6 months that will help communities be able to obtain mortgages and qualify for mortgages easily, especially in this market. We know the market has changed a lot, but it starts with educating our partners, and that's what we're working on right now.
And just if I can add, for example, our website, masteryourcard.org, that's where we keep all of our resources. So we have handouts, videos, learning platforms, and we do a lot of different things in different communities. I was just in Texas, in El Paso, at UTEP. We did a big career fair there. We're doing the same thing, and this goes back to the previous question, this week in Atlanta to hit some of the HBCUs. Again, because we want to reach out to the community. We want that talent. So that's one of the things that we do.
Yeah, real quick, we've got 3 minutes left.
So at Unidos US, I didn't do the usual spiel of what Unidos US is, because I think most of you in the audience know, but we have nearly 300 community-based affiliates across the country. There are 2 networks that a number of our affiliates are part of. One is our Housing Counseling Network, and the second is our Financial Empowerment Network. Groups that are part of those 2 networks offer, in the case of the housing counseling, pre-purchase home buying programs, education through the homebuyer process. The Financial Empowerment Network, they offer financial coaching and financial literacy. So you can go on our website, look at our list of affiliates, and see which ones are either part of the financial network or the housing counseling network And you can refer your friends and family in we're across the country for both those services.
I also appreciated the crypto question. I promised the panel I would not go too deep onto crypto, but for more, I quit to start my own crypto company. It's backed by the CEO of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, and a Facebook education newsletter called Crypto Uncomplicated. And also, please feel free to hit me up after this. We can chat more crypto. Even Mike's a crypto guy, so I didn't know that was happening. We've got one more question. Time for one more, yeah.
So I spent a large portion of my career actually working in banking in emerging markets. And most of the people that are in emerging markets are unbanked. And actually being in South Africa, you also realize that because of the history, there's a lot that's done through BEE, which is Black Equity Empowerment programs to actually even provide saving. Like you can go to a grocery store and buy a bond at Checkers. That's like $500. And most people that are unbanked use M-Pesa or on a telephone system, and 42 million who are unbanked, not in brick and mortar, use this every day to transfer money and get loans. And I'm just wondering, when are we gonna catch up to just leveraging that and people get loans and are credited through data on their phone, and also people that are on the bottom of the pyramid have more access than some of the people here?
I've seen that. I don't know how it works, but I've seen that. And I'm surprised, you transfer money through your phone and using your mobile service, I believe, but I'm not close to it. I don't know how it works, but I've seen it. Yeah. And it was interesting.
Education, right? There you go.
Education.
But there are a lot of apps, a lot of companies out there who are putting out apps. I could tell you a slew of them, but off the top of my head, I can't right now. But that are sort of getting into it. And you're right. In the U.S., it's very slow to adopt. In other countries, it is quite a lot easier. And I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, I have my reasons, but you don't want to hear that.
I can imagine one problem that has emerged in this space is assurances from consumers that their privacy is going to be maintained and their personal data is going to be protected. And when we talk about challenges of technology, these assurances are going to have to go hand in hand with the innovation that's being presented. I saw it in New York City in a residential community where in the city council, they introduced a regulation that basically said no biometric keys at all. And you have to have metal keys. Why? Because there's a distrust that the information, their personal data, when they go into a home, when they come out, when they go to if they're coming in the middle of the night, who's going to have that data? Even if they should have this data. In Toronto, there is a great residential community development program that would have really set a new bar in terms of sustainability. It was entirely scrapped because the residents did not feel that their data would be protected. And until there's the assurances, and that's why it's important for companies that can to register with the CFPB, to basically say, look, your data belongs to you and no one else, I think we'll see these opportunities in technology really take place here in the United States.
Awesome, thank you.
I think with that, we're pretty much there. We covered a lot of ground. Hopefully hopefully you learned a little bit of something somewhere in there. I think I did for sure. But yeah, appreciate all the questions. I'd be remiss if I didn't remind everybody that there is the last closing keynote, Immigrant Strength and Immigrant Dreams, coming up after this. But I appreciate you all for sharing all that with us. I definitely can say I learned a lot. For Laura, Jimmy, John, and Mike, appreciate you guys listening. Thanks again, and thanks again to you guys for the time.